Right. So good afternoon. Happy Friday. Let's get rolling. So today is our part 2 with regard to groups and problem solving. So we'll be looking more into some of the ways that we can brainstorm or effectively collaborate and facilitate group meetings. And then we'll be doing a scenario a little bit later. It's one of the options you could use for a small group assessment that'll ask us to think about how we facilitate meetings effectively, especially as we're dealing with varied and unique sets of people to work with. All right. So I wanted to do a quick recap of some of the things that we talked about last class. Last class, we talked a lot about decision making and how groups can work together effectively to reach a solution or conclusion to an issue. So oftentimes, right, we're placed in groups in which our group is tasked with doing something. Perhaps we're in a team for work, or we're asked to produce a document by the end of the meeting. We're in an athletic team and we're asked to go and succeed and do our best job at a game. Or perhaps we are working in a class, so we're asked to produce some type of project by the end of that class meeting. We save a whole lot of time and money if our ability to work together in a group to solve the problem, get to the bottom of whatever it is, happens more quickly and efficiently, right? So our ability to reach a decision is challenging because we're put into a lot of groups in which it feels inefficient. It feels like you're spinning your wheels and you're not getting along. So developing these skills is important. We talked last class about some of the ways that groups can arrive at a decision or not, right? Sometimes you're eating ice cream and the ice cream plops on the ground, right? That is a plop. That's not reaching a decision. You just look at the code and you're disappointed because you put time and effort into that ice cream and went for nothing. Same goes for a meeting. And we talked about some of the other ways that groups can reach decisions too. Delegating, averaging, voting, consensus. Oftentimes we like consensus, but we also know that that's not something that every group can do, especially if you have a diversity of opinions and perspectives in that group. You have to find a way to move forward to avoid getting stuck in gridlock. We also talked last class about the Tannenbaum-Schmidt continuum, right? This is a continuum that helps us to understand to what degree a group leader is facilitating the involvement of other members of the group. On the one extreme, right, we have autocratic. This is somebody saying my way or the highway. I have made this decision and you have to go along with it. I've decided to have this booth that our team is going to do. And all the way on the participative end is an approach in which the leader is not even setting an agenda. The leader is saying, you all get to decide what's important and what to do, and I will work to represent and move forward on what the group agrees. This is not to say that any one of these approaches is inherently better or worse, rather to say that context and situation is going to dictate which of these types of approaches you're more likely to use. I'll ask you to be thinking about some of these, especially in regards to today's scenario and what makes sense for you as you're facilitating a group. Lastly, we talked last class about some of the issues in brainstorming effectively, right? The idea that sometimes when we're in a large group, our ability to speak is a smaller slice of the pie. So we find that our ability to remember what we wanted to talk about is a little bit harder. We tend to match the other energy of people in the group, and we also tend to overestimate how well the group and its use of time went. For today, we're going to be talking a bit more about creativity and the ways in which creativity can allow groups to solve problems effectively. And then we're going to be talking about facilitation. This is a topic we're going to be exploring in more depth next week. Next week is going to get into how groups can use meetings and organize and set up meetings to be as effective as possible. But facilitation is a good entry point to understanding how to do that. So in order to understand and to get into the creative process, I think it's important for us to understand this idea of biases. Last class, we used the example of Who Moved My Cheese, right? It's a popular book in the business world. It's got 2 mice and 2 humans. The mice, right, adapt and recognize that the cheese is going to move to different locations. They sniff it out, they seek it. The humans assume the cheese is going to be in the same place every time. They keep going there, and then it's not there. What do? Right? Our ability to adapt to change, our ability to recognize that tradition and institutional knowledge can be useful, but also our ability to change and adapt to the times, right, and do things differently is another really important thing for us to consider when we're working at ideas, right? That is, our ability to connect ideas, oftentimes in unconventional and unexpected ways, is really important. Last class, we did the activity about planning for a birthday party, and some of the ways that you all were able to kind of merge and combine ideas together, I thought was really cool. Having an adjustable basketball hoop, having things like books as like favors that you could give out for the gift. Those were some great ideas that did a great job of linking together 2 concepts that might otherwise seem to be pretty separated, right? So our ability to think on our feet, our ability to be creative are important for a group. On the topic of creativity, by association, and our ability to collaborate effectively, I feel like I need to go on a mini rant that I do think is relevant to these issues, right? How many folks have been following some of the discussion and coverage or have heard of ChatGPT? Okay, so a few of you. How many people have never heard of it? Okay, so some variation here and there. So, I'm involved in a lot of educator circles, including on social media. I follow a lot of teacher TikTok, and there are so many takes from educators who are very freaked out about ChatGPT, right? And a lot of people in other fields who are anxious about its implications. So a couple months ago, right, it was developed and kind of launched and gained a lot of traction as a way in which AI could be used to generate pretty extensive content, right? So not only could it make a simple sentence, but AI was being used to generate what were effectively competent letters, essays, and other types of written documents, and could do so with a level of complexity that we hadn't really seen properly, right? So as you can probably imagine, there have been a lot of people who have been really anxious about what that means. A lot of teacher friends who I've talked to who have said, oh no, ChatGPT, that must mean that students are going to use it to write essays, and it's not going to be their original work. They're just going to punch it into an AI, give it a prompt, and it's going to write it for them, right? And have suggested solutions about increasing monitoring and surveillance of students to make sure that they don't do that. And I think that approach is kind of backwards, right? Because in my opinion, technology is a genie you can't put back in the bottle, right? Things change, things develop. We've had a lot of changes in technology and development. For example, right, we have autocorrect, word processing. We have the ability to use resources like Grammarly and other software that allow us to edit, make changes, and optimize the things that we write. And things like AI change. And we also know that a lot of employment and job sectors are changing along with it, right? There are more opportunities to expedite and, yes, even change hiring based on the ability to use AI to do some writing. So from my perspective, rather than say, oh, we need to monitor and make sure that that's not being used, I think the approach is to change the types of responsibilities, tasks, and assignments that we ask people to do, right? In other words, I think to be competitive in today's market, we have to learn to do things that AI can't do. In other words, asking you to reflect on, to apply, and to use examples from your own personal experience. In a class like this one, right, is designed in a way that's meant to be something independent, that is not something an AI can do because they can't reflect on their own personal experiences. But in the same way, right, jobs have to adapt and change and reflect that this technology exists, that a lot of companies are saving time and money and employment by using it, and instead by asking for people to do and engage creatively in new ways that, again, outpace that technology, right? So how companies are responding, how industries are responding, how they're using or adapting or changing in light of this, right? You might have your own takes on all this, but all that to say, right, we're in a changing landscape, we're in a changing world, there are a lot of changing resources available, and our ability to adapt, to think about how they impact the group and the way the group behaves, that's an important piece of our group's abilities to work effectively on issues, right? The need for creativity and adaptation. So that gets us to thinking about how groups can engage creatively and thoughtfully. And a really big piece of that is the idea of brainstorming. So I'm going to share an example in a little bit about Pixar's creative process. You might know them for a lot of very famous movies and franchises, right? Finding Nemo, Toy Story, you name it. So one thing that I found really interesting is in the very beginning, some of the original founders of Pixar actually had a dinner together, right? And during their dinner, they came up with a lot of the original ideas that they used in many of their first movies. So a lot of the ideas that inspired films like Toy Story or WALL-E, right, were ones that came over the course of a single dinner. And that was an example of a starting out point, but they've since branched out to allow a lot of talent and employees to come together and figure out ideas in a more collaborative capacity. So brainstorming is generating new ideas, right? It's the process by which we as a group are figuring out what the heck to do. So brainstorming is something that we talk about a lot, that term gets used a lot, but I think breaking down what makes effective brainstorming in a group is important. One of the first things for group brainstorming is to give it time, right? Brainstorming doesn't happen in an instant. If you give somebody a minute and say, come up with ideas, you're probably not going to get very many ideas. You give somebody a prompt, perhaps a week in advance, and ask them to consider it as they're going into the meeting, and then you give them time to work through and develop that idea. Then they've got a lot more opportunity to explore and develop those ideas further. Another thing you really have to think about is the climate of the small group, right? We'll talk more about groupthink later, but the idea that people are less willing or likely to share their own perspectives and ideas based on the perception of judgment is an important consideration. If you're in a climate in which people are likely to shoot down an idea that's new or different by saying, oh, that's a bad idea, that's dumb, that's silly, that's a bad question. Well, you're less likely to get people who are openly sharing their perspectives. Or if you have one person who dominates the group discussion, dominates the creative input of the group, they're the brainstorming person, then maybe there are other people who have ideas or have ways to second guess or develop or explore an idea further who are not given that same opportunity. So brainstorming in a group is fine and dandy, but we do have to create the material circumstances by which brainstorming can happen effectively. Brainstorming is more concerned with variation in creativity rather than quality, right? Brainstorming means that we're going to have a whole lot of really bad ideas, right? One of the things I love to do is, like, if you're really into like animated shows, you like look at the creators. They have a whole lot of scrapped ideas and concept art, like characters who never ended up showing up because they were like silly or poorly designed, right? We have a lot of ideas that do not make it past the cutting room floor. So our ability to come up with these ideas and our ability to sift through them, that's important. So one analogy that I think is an interesting way of thinking about how we engage creatively differently is the idea that people tend to fall more into one of two camps, either being brooders or spawners, right? So if you're a brooder, you're kind of like an ostrich. Think about ostriches, right? They lay eggs, but their eggs are very large. They're very protective of those eggs, right? When ostriches lay eggs, they just kind of hang out over them and they are very, very, very fiercely protective. You might think about penguins, right? The way that penguins like hold the eggs as they waddle around and protect them. In the same way, if you think about creativity and brainstorming and problem solving, these tend to be folks in a group who have just a couple, maybe one idea, and they're really attached to that idea. They're cultivating, they're protecting that idea, they're allowing that idea to grow, and they really try to find the right time and place to share that idea. They want to share a really quality one that they're able to develop over time. On the other end, right, we have creatures like sea urchins. Another example you can think about would be seahorses, or you can even think about sea turtles, right? If you're familiar with sea turtles, they tend to lay a lot of eggs on the beaches, and the sea turtles hatch and they try to crawl over to the ocean, and only very few of the eggs actually make it all the way to the ocean once the sea turtles come out, right? There's a lot of birds and other things that unfortunately get them on the way to them. So in that case, these are folks who come up with a whole lot of ideas. They're throwing a lot at the wall to see what sticks. A lot of their ideas are going to be bad, but they do allow the group to cover their bases and really identify a lot of potential solutions to issues, right? So again, creatively, we tend to follow in one of those two camps. We have a couple ideas we're really attached to. We have a whole bunch of ideas that we don't really care about, but this helps us to have groups who are engaging in the brainstorming process differently. We have a variation in their approaches. As mentioned, right, Pixar originally started with just a couple major leaders in the group who would use creativity amongst each other to guide their films. But they took that creative principle and applied it more broadly to the entire organization. And I wanted to share a quotation from Ed Catmull, who's in higher administration of Pixar, who did a good job of describing some elements of their creative process and the way that brainstorming can happen effectively. That the director and other creative leaders don't come up with all the ideas themselves. Rather, every single member of the 200 to 250 person production group is making suggestions. Creativity is at every level, artistically and technically. The leaders are sorting through the ideas that fit coherently and support the story. And they describe it as being kind of like an archaeological dig, right? Where you're digging through all the ideas to find one. I think this is really interesting because, again, if you're a leader of a group, you tend to have a chilling effect on brainstorming of the group. If only your ideas are the highway, then you're less likely to have that variation that might make the group work really well. But at the same time, as a leader of a group, you are responsible for some level of decision making, right? You might be somewhat democratic in your approach, but you are trying to figure out which of those ideas work. So the ability to not only brainstorm, to open up the entire process for brainstorming, but also the ability to take decisive action and recognize some ideas are going to work better than others, and it's your responsibility to figure out which ideas work, is something that you can do effectively through small group engagement. And this brings us to the idea of group facilitation, right? Group facilitation is referring to the ways in which we're able to make the work itself that we do in a group easier or harder. All of us would love to save a lot of time and money in how our groups behave. We're at work, right? It'd be awesome to get out of work early, or it'd be great to feel like you're a part of a team working on a school project, and you get that project done in an hour, or you study and you feel really good about your ability to prepare, right? So our ability to facilitate effectively is really important for our group to work the way that we want it to. So facilitation and how to facilitate a group effectively involves a lot of different factors. And again, we'll be looking at some of the ways you can apply these more specifically to meetings next week. But I do want to lay out some principles that I think do a good job of capturing these ideas. One of the first things is to know the members of the group. This goes for whether or not you're a group leader, right? You're a group leader, getting to know people's names, understanding who they are, where they're coming from, and how their background is shaping their participation in the group is really important. If it feels like members of the group are really detached, like you don't even know them, or you don't care about them, then they're going to be less engaged and willing to participate. But knowing them is more than just knowing their names. It's knowing some of the ways that their dynamics, their expertise, and their backgrounds might play into the experience. Say you have somebody who's a plant, who's really good at taking on unconventional tasks. You might give them responsibilities based on that, or you might give people the option to select the tasks that they're most interested in, or even elect people to roles such as a treasurer, vice president, president, and so on, that align with people's interests. Another thing to think about are some of the ways that dynamics might facilitate the group for better or for worse. Maybe you have a group of 2 or 3 people who like to chat and do side conversation all the time. Maybe you break them up for a smaller activity that you're asking people in the group to do, right? So knowing the group members, knowing their dynamics, and also perhaps pushing the group members to try things that they haven't done before is an important way that you can help facilitate a group effect. You are able to pick up on patterns, oftentimes from previous meetings, and you can use those to help the future meetings go better. Another thing to think about here is to weigh tasks and relationship considerations, right? Nobody wants a leader who says, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, and I'm gonna kick it with my Mai Tai and, just lounge in the back, right? You don't want to feel like as a group member, the group leader is doing their responsibilities, so delegating tasks is important. It's also important for us to think about how our ability to manage tasks is lending itself to the strengths of the group. Again, you might push people to try something new, to become trained in something that they don't normally know how to do, but you might also encourage people to take on tasks that fit in their passions and interests in a way that helps them to really feel like they're contributing to the group. When you're thinking about relationships, you might think about the relationship between members of the group, who works well together, who doesn't really work well together, who helps the group become more efficient, who doesn't. What are the different strengths of those group members? Really taking stock of those and how you're structuring the way the group behaves is an important consideration too. Another thing that I think is useful is to think about human psychology, right? So this is not a psychology class, but I do think considering some of the factors that influence our behavior in meetings is a useful way to help those meetings work well. I mentioned earlier in the term, right? If you are holding a meeting at like 11 o'clock and it's a 3-hour meeting and it offers no breaks, there's a good chance that about 45 minutes in, that meeting is going to go off a cliff because people are hungry, they're going to want lunch, people are going to want breaks, especially for meetings that go more than an hour. And those concerns are going to trump the desire to participate in a meeting. We're humans, we gotta eat, right? Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, gotta get those fulfilled before we're willing to engage in that way. So that's an important consideration, is how are we thinking about what humans do and how humans are naturally going to act once we put them in a meeting setting, right? One of them is learned behaviors. So perhaps over time, members of the group have learned that they don't need to be that focused. They can detach, right? They can do social loafing and let other people take control. Well, maybe you change up the meeting and say, this time you're tasked with leading the group, right? And that might be a way to adjust the learned behaviors that they have. Thinking processes, perhaps the group is arriving at the same conclusion and thinks through issues in the same way every time, right? The ability to challenge and push them back a little bit is important. We also have unconscious processes, things like biases that impact our judgments of an issue without really taking the time to unpack and understand why we feel the way. Maybe we say, oh, I'm not good at math, I'm not really a numbers person, that's never been my strong suit. But your aversion to it over and over has kept you from being able to develop a skill set that you need, right? And by practicing and learning some basics, you can get good at that. And again, biological processes. You got to eat, you got to have water, you got to go to the bathroom. If we can't do that, then we're not going to participate, right? So that's the important consideration as far as engaging in the group and some of the needs of the group too, right? And doing everything that you can to prepare for those issues as they come up is really important, right? Several years ago, I was involved in a meeting, and before that meeting, they ordered lunch for everybody. And I'm a vegetarian. They came in and gave me a chicken sandwich, and I was a little bit peeved. And I was really hungry for the rest of the meeting because there wasn't an opportunity to check in about dietary restrictions going in. So another thing to think about here is disruptions. Whether we like it or not, there are going to be things that interrupt and prevent the meeting from going smoothly, right? Murphy's Law, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. Life happens while you're making plans. You can have a perfect agenda, right? You can Leslie note and have this giant binder that documents the exact meeting and how it's going to go, but you can't control for what people are going to do. Perhaps somebody immediately has to leave a meeting because there's an emergency that comes up. Perhaps somebody comes in 15 minutes late into the meeting. There are going to be things that disrupt that. Perhaps people get into a verbal disagreement with each other, especially if you're working with younger folks. So our ability to respond effectively to those issues as they come up is really important. Sometimes if there's a significant issue that comes up, maybe it means that you need to refocus the topic, talk about that issue in a different way. Maybe it's important enough that it came up in a really big and significant way, right? I'll give you kind of a silly example, also kind of a concerning one. When I was in middle school, there was a science teacher who like randomly in class had this like thing flash on the screen that showed that he was recording the class, but without telling us, and it was really weird. And then he like really got stammered when he got put on the spot. And then in our next class, we were all really concerned about this. And we like, instead of having the normal class with the teacher, had the teacher sit down and talk to us about what happened to the entire class. Sometimes there's weird things that come up and can drastically change the meeting. And our ability to adapt to that is really important. And then lastly, it's important for us to keep returning to the task, right? One thing that I encourage if you find yourself as a leader or facilitator in a group is not to necessarily shut down conversation or small talk or what seems unproductive when it happens. In fact, creating conversation and small talk, that can be a glue that helps hold a group together. You get to know people, you know their names, you learn a little bit, you check in with them, and that helps the group better trust one another and work together in other situations. But you do want to reach a point where it feels like you've got to move on and you've got to return back to the task, right? And a big way that you can balance that out is to recognize that you're not going to be able to cram like 2 or 3 pages worth of agenda items into a half-hour meeting. So pacing yourself, knowing that you're working with humans, right, who have their own set of concerns and issues, and that things are not going to go perfectly is important. And this brings us to the idea of co-liberation, right? The idea that ideally a group is more than the sum of its parts. That the joy and the passion of working in a small group is the idea that you're coming up with ideas, you're working together, you're drawing from each other's strengths, and you're doing more with less as a result of working together effectively. We're working joyfully and creatively, ideally. This might be a very theory-wide-oriented approach, that we're achieving self-actualization through a group participation. That happens through a combination of your own engagement with engagement with the group, right? If you're the only one who's engaging, you're probably alienating the group, or people are alienated within the group because they don't have the opportunity to participate too. And if only they're engaging, right, you are conforming and probably engaging in social loathing. So our ability to find out how we can participate effectively in the group and also ensure that people in the group are engaging with us is reaching that sweet spot, right, where we're able to work effectively with one another. So, given some of that information, today's scenario, I'm going to ask you to start by addressing this prompt on your own, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to chat about this prompt in small groups. So, congrats, you are the coach of a high school soccer team, and your goal is to facilitate a positive environment in which that high school soccer team is able to learn and succeed together. What I want you to think about first of all is, what do you need to do in order to effectively facilitate this small group? You might think about the population you're working with, what it might be like to work with high schoolers on a soccer team. What are the things that you need to do to make that meeting go well? Second of all, right, you're going to be working with high schoolers. I work with high schoolers, and many of you have recently come out of high school, and it can be a disruption at times. What are you going to do to manage disruptions as they come up? And then lastly, think back to Tannenbaum Schmidt. We have the spectrum of autocratic, democratic, and participatory. Within that spectrum, how would you choose to work with this group? And why would you choose this particular approach? So I'll give you several minutes to work on this on your own, and then ask you to work in groups on this for your attendance credit for the day. give your group, selves about a couple more minutes. Then I'll ask you to break into groups to discuss this further. So once you have finished your attendance, part one, what I'm going to ask that you do in groups is to share what your responses were to the individual prompt. What did you conceive of as the way that you'll facilitate this group with high school soccer players? And then once you've shared your perspectives here, what do you notice as similar or different about the ways that other members of your group have discussed facilitating this work with soccer players? And then after that, take some time to see and perhaps reflect on whether or not your opinion has changed about how you might choose to manage this small group based on what you have observed and heard from other people in the group. So it looks like we've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So let's do 3 groups of 4. All right. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when you have finished part one, feel free to break into your groups, share your ideas, and reflect on what you're noticing from working together on this as a group.
Do you want us to write down and turn in the second part others or?
No, you can share these, and then if you have any additional insights or your perspective has changed at all, you can add that to your individual program.
So, the first question, I think the decide when you say what they
Online first one was basically, build the team identity. What you have there. And you know, this is what we're doing here. This is that. And then, people's kind of focus more, you know, maybe, you know, on the task.
Big part as well, and then way.
I don't want to be broken up here. So I put salary drills on the field. We're gonna do one on those facilities and
Yeah, well, my most we always been like in building the same. They died. And then. Like we worded it different, but you know. It's like we might have prioritized. But that was, okay, all right, so, yeah, it's quick to two, I guess. Instructions, so what I put in probably like, it would present my life, probably have a sliding scale, so like. You can ask about it. That's kind of what I put, like, you know.
Can't help it. So.
Right, like disruptions happen, so like, you know, don't get too like hooked up about them. But then, you know, if they continue to happen, you'll be more strong more than if it still happens, you know, they're gonna have to make a beat with that. So, you know, the severity.
It is like. Definitely.
Problems. And I think it's really important, like you come on here, the different, in those parts. And like, I understand how they're gonna respond from some, maybe not having them on those days. If somebody does, they can't like how do or how do you.
I mean, I think I do.
And then once you know.
Punishment in the locker room. That's gonna be ready, but. And then, on the one side.
Yeah. In general, you know, they have this on playing scale, it keeps up. with Yeah. Finally. All right, so what method would we use for decision making? I thought it was the one right under like autocratic. I can't remember what it was called though. Looked like there was one that. Look, no, there's. Yeah, well, it's just like, autocratic, democratic, and then, participatory. But there was one between like, democratic and,
Yeah, there's
autocratic. There was six total. Like,
So there's autocratic, the two in between sides, and the democratic, the two in between. And then participant.
I liked it there too.
Groups have 2 more minutes to discuss, and we'll come back.
Yeah, they'll just have descriptions. Yeah, I went, pretty heavily into the participatory side of it, because I think allowing them all to voice their opinions about them is a really good idea. And both of them are perspectives that I don't have. And they are specialized in whatever role they play in the team, so they probably know themselves.
And like something that people rather than people that are opposed to serve them. Anyone can be on the field, just like that. There are situations.
One thing I did, you did.
Right, it really depends on how you interpret it, you know, 'cause I read it as like, you know, like, how would you set the agenda and stuff for the meetup?
Yeah, that's
That
what
side of thing. That's what I was thinking when I read it, not like just.
Yeah, and just in general, my thought is like more often than not, like, there's a participant, right, like. You got this, right? But yeah, it's pretty even split, and I think it's just kind of like what.
It teaches a lot of stuff.
Is he? Nick? The best.
Getting there, huh? We're only halfway through the show.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get it finally on the back.
That happens.
All right, so it sounds like groups are just about wrapped up, so let's go ahead and come together here. Right, So how many folks said that they wanted to run the group in a more autocratic style? All right, democratic, participatory. Okay. There's also a question that came up over the discussion, right? So while this continuum has those three, there are some things here and there that are kind of in between those two. So might be somewhere between autocratic, democratic, participative, just so that you have that for your reference. Yeah, so bit of a split, but definitely leaning more toward the autocratic side. One thing that I think is useful when you're leading a group meeting and you're thinking about your role in that is think about how other people in the group see you, right? What is the ethos and credibility that you do or do not bring to the table, and how might that dictate the way that you run a meeting? For example, if you are coming back as a coach, maybe you were on the high school soccer team, you just graduated and you're coming back. There's a chance that a lot of people on the team know you, remember you, you have a lot of goodwill, and it's likely that a more democratic approach is one that makes sense with the trust that you've cultivated in the group. Or maybe you're a new coach who's come on after a high school team that's had a whole lot of turnover, has had a whole lot of problems, hasn't really had a stable coach, and you're trying to establish order. You might be more autocratic in your approach. So context matters, right? Situation matters in terms of the style that makes the most sense. Considering your own role in relationship to the rest of the group, you might find yourself dealing with establishing credibility through structure or trying to create engagement with other people. How many folks found that their approach to managing the group was a little bit different, or they felt a little bit differently after hearing from other folks? Yeah, my other class was the same way. A lot of people still felt that the way that they held a meeting made sense to them, even after hearing some variation in ideas. And I think that just speaks to the way in which, our own talents and our own strengths can lend itself to how we manage a group. Maybe you're a really good cheerleader and a really good team player, and you bring that into delegating and allowing people to be involved. Or maybe you're really detail-oriented and specific, and so that structure lends itself to the way that you manage meetings. When it comes to the style, right, I think it's important to put that in light of what your strengths are and what you're looking for out of the meeting, right? Is this this is the way it is, or is this a let's work together type of meeting? When we think about disruptions and facilitation, right, it happens in high school, people are going to verbally argue. It's going to become, as a couple of groups mentioned, right, an issue of ego and popularity. So managing transparency, not picking favorites, explaining why perhaps being part of a traveling team is selected, and also giving people the opportunity to share their concerns with the group. Dealing with and quickly ending a disruption so that it doesn't become the norm is an important element of that. And also, the idea of leading or managing a group means that you're consistently asked to be an example or role model for the group. We don't like it sometimes, right? We don't always want to be the role model, but it is something that leadership puts a spotlight on for us. So all things to continue to explore as we're thinking about the roles that we take on and the ways that we choose to behave when we're managing and leading some of the interests and needs of the group, and thinking about the context in which we're doing it. So to wrap up for today, we talked about facilitation, how we're able to effectively run and engage in group meetings, and some of the challenges that can arise when groups are dealing with conflict, when we're considering some of those factors like credibility, age, and so forth. And we'll continue to look into those next week when we talk about ways to effectively run meetings. So if you haven't already, please email or pass forward your attendance activity for the day. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the sun. Also, registration for spring courses is open for seniors and will open on Monday for everybody else. So I encourage you to look into that, get in touch with your advisor, and get ready to register for courses. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for the rest of your day.
Thanks, Daniel.
I hate that they open it so soon. Why can't they open it like
Thanks, you.
Also, I think they